right, so we'll reward our punctual attendees by getting started right now. Thanks for attending, everyone. This is our Planning for Coastal Resilience webinar. My name is Zach Vega. I'm a community planner with the Land Information Access Association. We're a nonprofit based out of Traverse City. So on tonight's docket, we've got two speakers. We'll have, technically three. We'll have Matt Warner from the state of Michigan introduce some of the programs that Eagle's working on. And then we'll follow that up with a presentation by Dr. Guy Meadows from Michigan Tech University, and then Dr. Richard Norton from the University of Michigan. So tonight's presentation, we're going to be talking about how to build resiliency for coastal communities. I just want to quickly thank our project partners and sponsors of this work that we do. So I'd like to thank the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and NOAA, and then our partners at U of M and Michigan Tech. So the purpose of this program is really to study and analyze the potential coastal hazards that we have along the Great Lakes. A lot of those we're very aware of right now as we're experiencing record high waters. And so what our project team has been working on for the past few years is not only collecting the data that shows what exactly is going on with the Great Lakes, but also to take that data and some of the policies that we're finding and engaging citizens, public officials, and community stakeholders across the state to help inform local land use policies so that we're making informed decisions that we can use to make sure that our coastlines are more resilient and that we're not making decisions that create unnecessary risks. So when we talk about coastal community resilience, we're taking the Urban Sustainability Director's network definition, and that's the ability of a community to anticipate, accommodate, and positively adapt to or thrive amidst changing climate conditions, and to enhance the quality of life, reliable systems, economic vitality, and conservation of resources for present and future generations. So tonight we're going to be looking at that definition of community resilience in terms of our Great Lakes shorelines. So many of you, I'm sure all of you have registered for this event on our resilientmichigan.org website. So if you're interested in some of the other projects that we've worked on around community resilience, I encourage you to go to resilientmichigan.org. You can see under the communities tab here some of the past projects that we've worked on, such as master plan updates, master plan chapters, and this year working on assessing communities, zoning, and master plans for resilience. There's also this documents tab right here that has a lot of great resources. That's where we keep our coastal resilience toolkit that has documents from around the state and different actors in getting this information out. We also have our community sustainability self-assessment tool that you can use within your community to assess not only your coastal resilience, but also your environmental, economic, and social resilience. So that's a great tool to at least start talking about these issues. I also encourage you to visit lia.org for more information on what we've been working on in this regard. And if actually three of our speakers tonight, Matt Warner, Richard Norton, and Guy Meadows are all featured in our Welcome to podcast. We currently have our Know the Great Lakes series going on. And so a lot of the information that you'll hear tonight is also covered in that, but more of a conversational tone. We'll also have more researchers on there going forward. So I just want to call attention before we get to our speakers that we currently have from the Coastal Management Program a one-to-one matching grant opportunity that we encourage municipalities that are on the Great Lakes shoreline to take advantage of. So what we're doing right now, because time is really running out and we can't do full master plan updates at this point, but what we can help you with is to use our sustainability self-assessment tool to assess your coastal resilience. We'll work with the stakeholders in your community to develop goals and objectives to guide future resilience initiatives. And all of that material you can actually use to roll into your master plan and use as a talking point for actually making sure that you're thinking about resilience in your planning documents going forward. So like I said, the time is running out to take advantage of that grant opportunity. All the work has to be completed by December 2020. If you're interested in this grant, you can visit resilientmichigan.org or you can email me at zvega.org. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt Warner from Eagle.
Thank you, Zach. Much appreciated. Thank you to everyone for joining tonight. Appreciate you all being here. Originally, we had hoped to go on the road with this effort and be there with you all in the Upper Peninsula. So unfortunately, due to COVID, we're doing this virtually, but we'll do the best we can. So again, my name is Matt Warner. I'm the Coastal Hazards Specialist with the Michigan Coastal Management Program out of Eagle. And again, we're pleased to be able to bring this program to you today. Before we dive in with our partners' discussions and talks, I just want to provide a little bit of background on kind of what brings us here today and what we at Eagle, in partnership with our Coastal Resilience team, are looking to accomplish through these efforts. So first, stepping back a little bit, the mission of the Coastal Management Program in Michigan is to protect, restore, and enhance and wisely develop our coastal natural resources and our maritime heritage along more than 3,200 miles of Great Lakes coast. We're one of the approved coastal programs under the National Coastal Zone Management Program, and as such, we receive annual funding from NOAA, which we're able to apply towards coastal regulations and technical assistance activities. We're also able to provide pass-through grant support for creative local coastal management efforts. And so it's really a unique partnership, multi-level, federal, state, and local community program. So that's really a nice aspect of the Coastal Zone Management Program. In addition to our regular funding streams, we're able to pursue funding for special program enhancement initiatives. And that's what brings us together today. Currently, we're in year 4 of a 5-year program enhancement strategy. And this particular strategy is focused on creating hazard-ready coastal communities. So really drilling down, and Zach talked about resilient communities. So this is taking it one step further, closer into the coast and drilling in on how do we sustain our beaches and dunes and utilize natural resources for protecting infrastructure rather than armoring or other sort of hard adaptation approaches. So as I mentioned, we have and as you know, as all of you are aware, we have an extremely long and very diverse coast in Michigan and in the Upper Peninsula. And so it really does take a village, if you will. Actions at the state and federal level alone cannot sustain our beaches and dunes in and of themselves. So we're going to need participation from our local units of governments, and we're going to need stewardship from our private citizens to really, sustain our beaches and dunes and have healthy coastlines moving forward. So that's what we're looking to really further through this partnership and drive hazard-ready coastal communities. And so one piece of that is fostering some community engagement as we're doing this evening. We're also working with our coastal resilience team to develop tools and information that really support local action policies and practices. And then we want to infuse this new information, coastal data, coastal information into local resilient plans and ordinances and other policies so that we have active coastal hazards management at all levels of government, including locally. So our core coastal resilience team and a team has grown over the 4 years, but the core team is represented on the call this evening, including Leah, Michigan Tech, and the University of Michigan. We're proud at the state of Michigan to be able to work with such a well-qualified group of experts and feel privileged to be able to bring this team to you tonight. Before I pass on to the panel of experts here, I do want to mention another grant opportunity, and folks with the communities there in the UP may be familiar with our typical coastal zone management grants. This is an annual grant funding opportunity, and we'll be releasing the next opportunity this October. And that call will include a call for projects that pursue development of local coastal resilience plans or ordinances, provide opportunities for projects that might conduct other coastal vulnerability assessments or other local projects, again, to further coastal hazards management and resilience efforts. As is the case with our grant funding opportunity, there will also be opportunities for coastal habitat projects, public access, and coastal community development. So just want to make sure that folks are aware of that grant funding opportunity. Updates and the grant funding opportunity will be posted to our webpage at michigan.gov/coastal management, again in October. So with that, I will pass on to the next speaker. Again, I thank you for joining us and appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get to Dr. Meadows' presentation. We have a relatively small group tonight, so feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom, and we'll try to answer that as we go. Also, you can use the raise hand feature, and I think we can make this a little bit more of a conversation and hopefully answer your questions as we go along if they come up. So feel free to use both of those features. And with that, Dr. Meadows, please take it away.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I'd just like to echo that we all wish we were doing this in person, and we hope everybody, you and yours, are all healthy and happy tonight. I'm Guy Meadows from Michigan Tech. I've spent most of my career working on the Great Lakes, and in particular along the coastlines. I'd like to share with you tonight some of the things that we've learned through this program working together, and go back as far as 1986 in our last episode of Really High Water here in the Great Lakes, and show you some of the things that we've learned over that very long period of time. Starting at the beginning, the Great Lakes are very new features, geologically speaking. They're created by the last retreat of the Laurentian ice sheet. That retreat began about 12,000 years ago, and the Great Lakes took their present shape about 8,000 to 7,000 years ago. So they're very new features. They're very steep-sided and very deep. And that causes what we call a background erosion rate. They are constantly broadening their width and filling in the deeper parts of the lake. And that's what we humans call coastal erosion. So it's a natural process in young lakes like the Great Lakes. For Lake Michigan, that is primarily a sandy shoreline, that background erosion rate, which means independent of anything we've done as humans to modify the dynamics of the lake, is about 1 foot a year. So again, the life of your mortgage, maybe 30 years or so, anywhere along the Lake Michigan shoreline, you should expect to lose at least 30 feet of your property. Obviously, in some places it's much greater than that, and in other places it's less than that. And then superimposed on that background erosion rate are all the things that we have done as humans to modify the shoreline, and all the things that nature does in terms of giving us cycles of high water and high wave energy activity like we're experiencing right now. So it's a very complicated process with many factors working together. Lake Superior is very much the same, but so much of our Lake Superior shoreline is a rocky shoreline, and that's a lot more stable than some of the things you're going to see tonight here along the Lake Michigan shoreline. So we have it bad up here in Lake Superior, particularly down at the eastern end where most of you are from, and we'll talk about what some of those issues are that face that. So In Lake Michigan and any of the Great Lakes, the sediment transport down the shorelines is the result of wave activity. It's only the waves that have large enough velocities to be able to pick up and move sediment grains. And it's the big waves that occur during the big storms that are of most concern. About 90% of all the sediment transport that happens over a year period happens during those few big storms. So it's those big wave events that are really causing damage to the shoreline. High water levels like we're experiencing now cause those waves to be able to work at what is perhaps the worst place, and that is at the base of the bluffs that surround our movable shoreline. So we'll see some examples tonight of how high water levels are the enabler that allow the waves to do the damaging work, but it is the waves that are actually causing the transport. As the wind blows over our Great Lakes surface, some of the momentum in the wind fields is transferred directly into the surface of the water. And that momentum transfer causes both the general circulation of the basin as well as the waves. And on human scales, those wave energies are enormous, and they are responsible for moving sediment. So the longer the open water distance that the wind is able to work on the water surface, the larger the waves. So the longer the fetch is, the greater than the waves. So that's manifested in the diagram you see here. If you look in the southern part of Lake Michigan, you'll see those large arrows moving down the Lake Michigan shoreline, and the same thing on the Wisconsin shoreline. That's the net movement of sediment. In the southern part of the basin, it's about 100,000 cubic yards per year moved past any one particular point. So that convergence of sand down the Wisconsin shoreline and down the Michigan shoreline is accumulating in the Gary, Indiana area and moving out into the deeper water of Lake Michigan and being lost forever to the nearshore region. Similarly, if you lived in the northern part of Lake Michigan, the dominant severe wave activity is from the south to the north, because that is the greatest distance. So in the northern part of Lake Michigan, it's the waves that roll all the way up the lake from Chicago that are the greatest threat, and that changes the direction of that sediment transport. And you noticed in the upper part here of the lakes that the transport is from south to north rather than the opposite in the southern part. So along the UP side, there's beautiful sand being converged along Highway 2 down that beautiful beach there. And it's the same result if we switch to Lake Superior. It's far more complicated in Lake Superior because of our rocky shorelines and because of the shape of the lake itself. Being oriented east-west, our prevailing winds are from west to east. So as we get down to the eastern end of the lake, there's tremendous sediment transport in the Grand Marais area on out to Whitefish Point. So we have very large sediment transport and a sandy shoreline along those areas. Similarly, for those easterly storms that are so famous for us up here, then again, the largest waves are incident along the Minnesota coastline and on down into the Wisconsin shoreline. The Keweenaw Peninsula, where I live, is a big obstruction that kind of even makes things even more complicated in terms of the wave dynamics. But Lake Superior is a monster to deal with. And if we look down here at the sediment transport, the same thing's happening east-west is happening in Lake Michigan, north and south. And that is on the eastern side of Lake Superior, sediment movement is primarily from west to east. And on the western end, it's primarily from east to west. So we have that same sort of bifurcation in how our sediment is moving. And again, that's all driven by the size of the waves and the direction from which they come. So why do water levels change so much in the Great Lakes? And this winter diagram, this winter satellite image, and this is from a colleague of ours, Drew Gonwald at the University of Michigan. it shows very dramatically that there's a tremendous exchange of water between the lake surface and the atmosphere. And that happens in both directions. Here in the wintertime, you can see moisture being picked up off the unfrozen lake and being placed into the atmosphere and transported out of the Great Lakes Basin. That evaporation happens both in wintertime and in summertime and is a loss of water from the Great Lakes region. And that's balanced by precipitation that falls on the lake, both in the forms of snow and of water. And it's not only what falls on the lake, but falls on the drainage basins that enter into the lake. So it's a very complicated mechanism that causes rising and falling lake levels, but it's something that happens on a continental scale. It's the systems that are moving across the North American continent. And if we look at some specific examples here, looking at the lakes in cross section, Lake Superior is some 603 feet above sea level. It is the deepest and largest of the Great Lakes. 53% of all the water in the Great Lakes system is in Lake Superior alone. Or another way of saying that is, if you added all the water in Lake Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario together, it will add up to less water than's in Lake Superior. So when we have high water levels, that increases the flow out of Lake Superior to the St. Mary's River and increases the flow into Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And as their water level rises, again, this all trickles downhill with water leaving Lake Huron and Lake Michigan through the St. Clair and Detroit rivers, causing low water levels to rise in Lake Erie. And again, Lake Erie dumps over the Niagara Escarpment into Lake Ontario, which eventually empties out through the St. Lawrence Seaway. So into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and into the Atlantic. So as we add more water in the top part of the system, it takes quite a while to work its way all the way down through the system. But keep in mind that with the water exchange in the atmosphere, there's 10 times more water transported over the Great Lakes in the atmosphere than makes this journey and flows out to sea into the Atlantic Ocean. So it's really the frequency and intensity of the storms over the Great Lakes Basin cause the water levels to rise and fall. Recently, 2012, Superstorm Sandy developed out of the Atlantic Ocean, traveled up the eastern seaboard of the United States and went ashore in New Jersey and caused tremendous shoreline damage and readjustment. And we've all heard about that on the news. But after it left New Jersey, it parked itself over the Great Lakes, and we felt the effects of this and received precipitation, large quantities of precipitation as a result of this massive storm. That's relatively rare. Most of our water that comes into the Great Lakes in the form of rain or snow precipitation originate over the Gulf of Mexico or over the Pacific Ocean. It's rare that we get a storm from the Atlantic. So our water level rises are the direct result of these storm activities. This is the history of water level variations in each of the Great Lakes. And I know this is hard to see, but over here on the far left side is 1918, and it's a record to 2020, right essentially to this year. These records actually go back to 1860. We have tremendous records of water level for all the Great Lakes way back to the Civil War. But the 1918 to present is the most reliable of those records. And I'd like to show you, this is Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, which are connected at the Straits of Mackinac, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. So in the same order of flowing downhill that we just talked about. But here, 1921 through 1927 are the Dust Bowl years across the Midwest that we've all heard about before the Great Depression. And notice Lake Superior was low at that same time. In fact, our all-time low for Lake Superior is still in 1926. We have not broken that low record yet. For Lake Michigan and Huron, you see that same low water conditions happening at the same time, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. So similarly, when water level is high, 1986 was our previous high all-time records. We were high in Lake Superior. We set records in Lake Michigan and Huron. And so these water level changes are related to things that are happening all across the continental United States. So it's a very dynamic system. I have some good news for you. This is the 6-month forecast by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This comes once a month, usually on the 4th day of the month. So this is the one most recently released on August 4th of this year. It shows us the current water levels going back a couple of years, 2018, 19, 2020. The red line is our current water levels, and you probably recall, but this graph reinforces that, is that we set new records in 2019, starting in May, June, July, August, September, all new records for Lake Superior. So we've had a tremendous increase in our water levels, and we experienced that a year ago. The good news is, here are those records this year that were set last year, 2019, and we are about 4 inches or so below where we were last year in Lake Superior. And we are projected here to peak in August and then start a downward trend for the rest of this year. So that is good news. So we are seeing, again, 4 to 5 inches, maybe as much as a ½ a foot decrease of where we were last year at the same time. So there was a question before the webinar started that what's it going to do next summer? Well, the Corps of Engineers only set their neck on the line for 6 months into the future. We'll have another 6-month forecast on the 4th of September, which will go a little bit further. But I'll put my neck on the line. I think we have turned the corner because we are substantially down from where we were last year. And I'll show you in a minute. We're very generous people up here in Lake Superior. We've given a great chunk of this water that came to us last year to Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and they're paying for that right now. So I'm going to stick my neck out and say we will continue to see this downward trend into the summer. So I hope that answers the viewer's question. This is Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. So notice they were high last year when we were setting new records, but they are setting new records this year. So all that water that we gave them last year through the St. Mary's River is now showing up in their records. And again, starting for every month of 2020, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron have set new all-time high records. So things are very bad in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron in terms of coastal erosion, because again, water enables those big waves and storm waves to do their work at the most vulnerable place, and that's the base of the dunes and the base of the bluffs. So if we think back, though, we probably have seen, it at least seems like there's been more storms and more intense storms. And that's true because those same storms that bring water that eventually shows up in the Great Lakes also bring with it increased winds and increased waves. So we'll talk about that in a moment. I'd like to kind of look a little bit back into history. Over at the far end is 1986, where Lake Michigan and Huron and Lake Superior all had very high water levels. They bounced around for a number of years, but starting in 1999, there was a very precipitous drop in water levels. And water levels remained unusually low all the way to 2013, where they started coming up, and they've been going up to the present time ever since. But this is unusual to see a 14-year period of very low water levels that persisted for that long. And that was also a time, the 2000s through 2013, when there was a lot of development along the Great Lakes shoreline. So it certainly happened here in Lake Superior, and it very much happened in Lake Michigan and Huron. So people were showing up on the beach. The beach looked very fat and inflated, and it was easy to be convinced that way, and will always look that way in the future, but we know that is not the case. A lesson from history, we started some of this work right after the high water in 1986. So this is a plot from 1958 on this side up to and through the high water of 1986, and actually ends in about 1990. The dotted line is the rise in wave energy, and I'm going to make it a little easier for you to see. And the solid line is the rise in water level over that same period of time. And some interesting things here. First, we start to see increased storm intensity and increased storm frequency. More storms showing up here in the Great Lakes. They have wind with them. So we start to see an increase in wave energy. And we have quite a few buoys out in Lake Superior that measure wind and waves. You can look at those on the Michigan Tech website or on the National Data Buoy Center website. And you'll notice that our wave energies seem to be increasing, and that is really true. And those same storms bring water, but it takes about 18 months for that water that they bring to work its way all the way into Lake Superior or to the lower lakes. So it rains on the water, but it rains on the land. It fills the woods with water that slowly moves through groundwater and finally finds its way into the lake. So there's quite a lag time. But what's really interesting, to me at least, is across the bottom is the shoreline damage in dollars during the same period of time. And the shoreline damage occurs in the peak of wave energy, not necessarily the peak in water levels. So again, water levels enable the waves to do their work at the most vulnerable place. And the beach adjusts for that, and we'll talk about how that happens. But here again, when we're in high water levels, our wave energy is actually about 25% greater than it is when we have low water levels. So the wave energy really does substantially increase at the worst possible time when the water levels are high. Well, how does the beach respond to that? So through that period of 14 years of unusually low water levels, the sandy coastlines built up very fat and happy. The part of the beach that's above water that we walk on got real fat. It formed foredunes or berms. It took long enough that the water level was low that the vegetation began to grow on those berms. But keep in mind, the land that was there prior to 1986, that eroded in 1986, was hard packed by the glaciers that formed the Great Lakes. And those glaciers were perhaps a mile or so in thickness over top of the Great Lakes. So that land was well compacted and relatively resistant to beach erosion. The sand that blew up on the beach, delivered to the shoreline by the low, mellow waves during low water time, is sugar sand, the real fine sand that we know and love here in Michigan. But it's very, very erodible. So when water level rises, that unconsolidated sand goes away very, very quickly. The beach will always adjust itself to changes in water levels, and we now know changes in wave energy that accompany that water level change to become the shape that is most dissipative to incident waves. And it does that by, here in the lower diagram, by giving up some of the sand that has been stored on the part of the beach that we walk on and placing that offshore in sandbars. And those sandbars have the function of tripping the new, stronger, bigger waves under high water and causing them to break multiple times before they actually reach the dry part of the beach. And it's that ability of the natural beach to continually readjust itself that makes it able to best survive these changes in water level and elevation. Well, if we come along as humans and change the ability of the beach to readjust itself, we give up that natural protection. So with the devastation all along the Great Lakes shorelines, thanks to Eagle and the Coastal Management Program, have allowed us to try and develop tools that make that easier for people to see how our beaches have changed. Very few of us were here on the beach in 1938, which is the first set of usable aerial photographs that we have for most of our coastline. But we have created what we call the 80-year look of the shoreline. We have the ability now to let you look down to an individual property owner's parcel of how your beach has changed from 1938 to the present. So this system is open to everyone to look at. You can get on there and explore your neighborhood, explore what has happened up and down your coastline, and how your coastline has responded. The website at the bottom of this page is the Michigan Tech site that gets you to that. 3 years ago, with, again, funding from Eagle, we started this on Lake Michigan, and 3 years ago and 2 years ago, it took us to figure out how to do all this and to do the entire shoreline of the lower peninsula of Lake Michigan. Last year, we did the same with Lake Huron, and this year we are concentrating on Lake Superior. So I'll show you some examples, but Lake Superior is a work in progress, but you can look at the other two lakes now, and by the end of this year, we'll have Lake Superior done as well. So what I have printed here, this is a section of shoreline in southwestern Michigan, in the Benton Harbor, St. Joseph area. The blue line offshore is the 1938 shoreline. The orange line out here in the water is the top of the bluff in 1938. The blue line on the edge of the shoreline now is the shoreline at the time of this photograph, which I believe was either 2016 or 2018. And the orange line is the top of the bluff. So this is how much the shoreline has changed in that 80-year period. And these are, again, glacial till and mostly sandy shorelines. This red hashed mark that you see onshore here is, given this erosion rate, this is where the top of the bluff will be in 30 years from now. And you can see there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure along this shoreline that is in danger. Then we also have oblique images from taken out over the water by small aircraft. And the next picture is that same shoreline taken from over the water looking in. And you can see that these homes that are in the face of danger are not small beach cottages. There is substantial infrastructure. You can also see a current revetment along this section of shoreline to try and curtail some of this erosion. And you can see the remnants out here in the water of a revetment that was probably established in the last episode of high water level, or possibly even before that. So first of all, revetments do not stop erosion. They may temporarily halt it, but there are penalties to pay for that. Some Lake Superior examples, although the 80-year look isn't completed. This is Middle Bay, just north of Marquette, for an example. It's a nice sandy shoreline, tremendous amount of sand in the offshore region. In 1939 is the first aerial photography that's available for this section. This is 1977. You can see the shorefront dwellings have really proliferated in that time span. There's still a large amount of sand in the offshore region in the shallow water, but not nearly as much as there was in 1939. By 2009, a lot of that sand has disappeared. The beach is getting very close to some of the homes. 2016, the beach is even closer to the homes, and there's been a tremendous dissipation of the nearshore sediment that most likely has moved offshore over these years. So this is the type of information we're trying to provide for both individuals and coastal communities that want to take a more resilient look and want to understand the dynamics of their particular coastline. In 2018, things are getting fairly critical in that region. So what caused the beach to change? And there's a number of structures that people invest in under the pretense that it's shore protection, but it's really shoreline armoring. It's not protecting the shore, it's protecting the property owner. There are shore perpendicular structures, those that stick out into the water like groins, and there are shore parallel structures. I'd like to start by showing you some examples of groins. So groins are a shoreline armoring that is designed to stop this river of sand that flows down the beach driven by the waves. So the groin is put at the downdrift end of the property owner's property, and its sole purpose is to act like a dam to trap sediment for the benefit of this property owner. The waves that strike this shoreline are able to carry, depending on their size and energy, a certain amount of sediment with them. When they are interrupted by the groin, they lose the ability to continue to move that sediment, and it's deposited in front of the owner's home. The waves that strike on the downdrift side are able to pick up that same amount of sediment, and there's no sediment already in suspension, so they pick it up from the beach itself, and you can see how this neighbor's beach has been carved out by the presence of groins. What unfortunately happens is when one person invests in a groin, that causes the next person to have to do the same, the next person, and so on down the line. If you happen to be the last person here on the far right and choose not to do something, you can see that this bluff and beach is eroding away terribly at the expense of everyone else damming up the sand for their own personal use. Our harbor structures are similar features. They are really big groins. These are two harbors, St. Joe Benton Harbor, which is a massive structure that sticks somewhere around 1,700 feet out into Lake Michigan. And this is New Buffalo, which is a recreational boat harbor, much smaller in scale. But again, you see the same process. They have blocked the transport of sediment from north to south. They have accreted a tremendous amount of land and deposited sediment on the updrift side at the expense of no beaches and devastation on the downdrift side. And you can see those again on both of these images of two drastically different size structures, but having identical effects. Just their region of impact is proportional to the scale and how far out they stick into the water. Shore parallel structures are structures like seawalls and revetments. Again, the processes are slightly different, but the end effects are very similar. So this section of shoreline has a revetment. You might notice that the sandbars are further offshore than they were in the previous spot. That happens because as the waves strike the revetment, it is far more reflective than a natural beach with a very low slope. And those waves reflect back out to sea and interact with the incoming waves, causing the water to deepen in front of the structures. So these revetment structures will typically fail by falling forward into the waves because the foundation of which they're sitting has been slowly eaten away by by their reflecting of wave energy. Here's a natural beach. You can see there's sediment very close to the shoreline. The natural beach is doing what natural beaches do, adjusting to high water and high wave energy. But if we move down here to where there's revetments, again, you can see a deepening of the water in front of the revetment and a driving of the offshore bars further offshore. So the combination of this makes this trench bigger and bigger year after year. When water levels do go down and the beach begins to build back up in these regions, it has to fill this trench before you see any presence of recovery. So it's a process that works to continually move sediment away rather than to keep it close to the beach as a natural beach would do. And again, here's some cartoons that show how that works. Same thing happens along our rocky coast like we have in Lake Superior. So again, it's very hard to maintain a sand beach in front of a rock coast because as the sand gets moved away, the rock becomes more and more reflective and is a very steep slope compared to what a natural beach. And again, that sand gets moved offshore, initially deposited in sandbars, but ultimately lost to deep water and a loss of a natural resource for the nearshore region. This is an example, again, in southern Lake Michigan. Here's a revetment in front of this house, and you can actually see those reflected waves bouncing back offshore. So it's a phenomenon that's easily observable. This revetment is sticking out so far in the water with the house perched on it that it's also acting like a groin to trap sand on the updrift side at the expense of the downdrift side. And this is the ultimate fate of revetments. As I say, they fail by falling into the water. They've turned the beach into a construction zone that's no longer safe for bathing, and the shoreline begins to retreat very fast once they have failed and are being overtopped by waves. We began this work right after the 1986 high water levels. We set up along Lake Michigan and Lake Huron a total of 45 survey lines. Most of those were on the Lake Michigan shoreline because, again, these are all sandy shorelines and very susceptible to erosion. We surveyed those mostly at least once a year and sometimes multiple times a year, especially in certain areas that were extremely hard hit, with the idea that we could understand how the beach comes back and to what extent the beach comes back after a major event of high water and high waves like 1986 was. So this is how I spent my summers from 1988 to 2008. For 20 years, we maintained these lines. And we took pictures. So this is line number 1, right at the Michigan-Indiana border. This is what that beach looked like after the last episode of high water level. The beach is very flat. These are actual surveys. So this is the shore survey crew, and there's a boat survey crew. We surveyed from the top of the dune or bluff to a depth of 30 feet below water surface, about 3,000 feet out into the lake. So these were real surveys over quite a substantial distance. But you can see here that there's a road up above here. You'll see some aerial photos in a minute. This is a storm drain on the road, and you can see this storm drain. The shore and the beach and the bluff has eroded to such a point where this pipe is totally hanging in the air here across there, very, very exposed. Either the Corps of Engineers or the Road Commission has dropped large limestone boulders to try and save the road up above. And again, they have probably contributed to the erosion here in the nearshore region. Well, in 2008, the time of our last survey, that beach has transformed from this to this. So yes, the beaches do come back. They don't come all the way back, but they really do come back. And especially over a 14-year period of low water level, which I said was relatively unique. If you look here in the insert diagram here is the end of that pipe that was hanging in the air. So a tremendous recovery in terms of the beach. And unfortunately, this is that time we talked about where there is tremendous development along our Great Lake shorelines. So if you showed up on this beach and you looked across this 250-foot wide, beautiful sand beach with vegetation growing and dunes growing, it would be hard to visualize that this land was underwater 20 years ago in 1986. And it really was underwater all that time. Since these are real surveys, here is how that beach changed. So again, this lower line here is the 1988 survey. This is up at the road here, the top of the bluff, and we're moving far offshore here. And I've color coded these so that you can see how things have changed. 1988, 1997, which was again a high water year, and you can see the beach is building some bars out here in the offshore region to protect itself. 1998, you could see again was high water and began to eat away at the shoreline and move that sediment, as beaches do, out here in the offshore to make a very gradual plateau that is designed by the beach to break those incoming big waves. Then we continued to have low water, and the beach continued to grow right up to the final 2008 survey. But keep in mind, these are in feet above sea level, that there is almost 20 feet of vertical growth of that beach and 250 feet of horizontal growth of that beach. So a tremendous comeback for the beach. We're planning on doing some of this same work again this year to capture the high waters that we've all experienced over the last couple of years. Here's a sad story. This is at that same location, where this survey line we just examined was built. And it's kind of a race here. This house is under construction in 2018. Water levels are rapidly rising. They've thrown a few boulders here in the front to try and curtail the retreat of this edge of the bluff. Here is an aerial view. This is the Michigan-Indiana border along this street here. So this home that we're focusing on is in Michigan and was built in front of this home that is in Indiana. Interesting. More has been added to the revetment, and this is in 2019. And this year, in 2020, the home is completed, and this is how it sits. And again, it is being built primarily on land that was not there in 1986. And this is about the same place we found in 1986, that the edge of the bluff where we showed you those pictures of the survey crew working. This little public access here is where we come down to the beach primarily. So this is truly built on land that didn't exist in 1986. Professor Norton has some of the legal issues associated with that he'll share with you very shortly. I want to wrap up by drawing your attention to another website. This is the Cape Cod Coastal Planner, developed for Cape Cod Island off the Massachusetts coastline. And if you go to this website, capecodcommission.org/coastal, they have a whole variety of 20 or 30 softer solutions and hard engineering solutions as well to shoreline management. And these are really worth taking a look at. If you click on any one of these, it tells you the pros and the cons of those particular choices, where they work best, where they don't work very well, approximate costs for doing these things. And I guess we'd like to stress that under high water and high waves like we're having now, there is not much you can do. But when water starts to retreat, as I'm predicting that it will, that is the time to do these types of soft solutions and get vegetation growing on those new bluffs and try and encourage their building in the natural beach building as best you can, because that is your money in the bank for the next episode of high water. And all predictions is these these episodes are going to continue, if not increase in magnitude. We will probably see lower lows and higher highs in the next 50 years. Some of the more aggressive alternatives here, again, the same website, include elevating structures, actually relocating structures if they're in dangerous areas, stormwater management, all types of options, and beach nourishment. And I'd like to end with beach nourishment, that is replacing sand on the beach that has been lost. And that can be done artificially by hauling sand from upland sources, or it can be done by redirecting material that dredges when the Corps of Engineers dredge our major harbors or our small harbors of refuge. And that was just done in St. Joe Benton Harbor. The Corps and the state allowed the city to engage with the Corps of Engineers with their dredgers and actually purchase additional dredging and have those dredge sands that are clean and healthy placed back on the beach. And as you can see here in this diagram, they're placing it in front of a vertical wall and a revetment to lessen the effect so that we have a natural beach again, both as a public trust beach as well as a natural beach able to absorb wave energy for the next event to come. So this is something to consider and starting to become a possibility here in the Great Lakes. So thank you for your interest. We'll both be around all of us will be around to answer questions. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you this evening, and hope we could do that in person. But thanks for sticking with us here.
Thanks, Scott.
Back to you, Zach. Yep.
So before we move on, does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask regarding what Dr. Meadows just presented? Feel free to use the raise hand feature or type it into the Q&A. There we go, we've got one. David Bardsley, you should be able to talk now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Meadows. The high water level in Lake Superior results in a lot, I would say, excess releases at the compensation works in Sault Ste. Marie, which aggravates high water levels, as he noted, in Michigan Huron. At low water levels on Lake Superior, because of the International Commission on Lake Level of Superior, there is restricted or held back water to Lake Michigan Huron, resulting in, I'll say, excessive low water. And so you'll see a 6-foot change from low water to high water in these extremes on Michigan Huron, whereas Lake Superior has a much shorter or smaller extreme between max water and low water. What would the case be if the compensating works just let things go naturally, or there were not a dam, as it were, at Sault Ste. Marie?
Good, excellent question, David. Appreciate it. The compensating works are able to slightly modify the rises and lowering of Lake Superior, and consequently correctly say the very small.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit. Let's see, you're freezing up a little bit. Let's see if you want to try to do that again, or
sure.
Okay, there you go.
Any better now?
A little bit, yep.
Great, thank you. So the compensating works, as you say, at Sault Ste. Marie are able to make a slight difference in the water elevations of Lake Superior and consequently to Lake Michigan and Huron. But the vast majority of the fluctuation is the water that's delivered through the atmosphere. It's a very small change that those compensating works can make. But the problem you indicate is very real, and that water needs to work its way out of Lake Superior into Lake Huron and eventually into Lake Erie and on out the system. And that takes several years. And as this slug of water works through, there will be unusually high fluctuations in all the lakes. You are absolutely correct.
Hey, Zach, you're muted.
There we go. That's an important thing to remember. So does anyone else have any questions before we move on to our next speaker? All right, well, I guess with that, Dr. Norton, please take it away.
All right. I'll share my screen. Can you see that okay, Zach?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks for sticking with us, everyone. I know this makes for a long presentation, so I'll try and work through my materials and leave some time for questions. So I'm building off of all of the information that you just got from Guy on what causes the lakes to go up and down, and then how that affects the shorelands along the Great Lakes. And so the question now becomes, well, what do we do to respond? How do we plan for and manage our shorelands in those, given those really dynamic coastal shoreline settings? So I'm going to be speaking to the planning and the policy and the legal aspects and implications of all of that. Before I start, I want to just point out that house. If you can see it, you might have noticed we've been using this image. This was a house that was built in St. Joseph, just north of the water outlet there. And there's a little bit of a story to tell, but just to give you a heads up, that'll come back through the work that we're doing. So again, this is just to remind you that this is work being funded by the Coastal Management Program, and it's a collaboration with a number of partners. So I want to start off by overlapping a little bit with Guy's presentation and kind of highlight three big picture takeaways for policy and planning and regulatory purposes. So the first is, and this is exactly the point that Mr. Bradley, I think his name was, just brought up. So the first thing to recognize is that lake water level fluctuations are primarily natural and they're semi-predictable. We know that they're going to keep going up and down, but we don't really know how high they're going to go or how low they're going to go or how frequently that's going to happen, but we know they're going to continue to fluctuate. And the other thing to note is we can't really engineer them. The amount of ability that we have to control those flows and the change in fluctuation is about inches compared to multiple feet over the total process. So really, there's very little that we can do to try and change those changes and fluctuations or moderate them, especially in the upper lake system. So we're kind of having to figure out how to plan for and manage given these natural forces. The second big picture takeaway that builds off of that is to recognize that in places that have sandy shorelines, the erosional processes that are taking place are natural and they're really, for all intents and purposes, unstoppable. We might be able to slow them down a little bit by trying to install arming structures, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, but recognize that it's really virtually impossible to stop them altogether unless we spend a lot of money continually replacing and maintaining, updating structures. The second thing to note is that erosional process happens in kind of a 2-1 step, or a dance step. It's 2 steps forward while the lakes are high and really working away on the shoreline, and then a step back when they go down. And then 2 steps forward again when the lakes come back up, and then when the lakes go back down and they're eroding, and then up again and down, and so on and so on. So the predominant process is to be moving landward where these erosional processes are taking place, but it happens in this kind of jerky 1 step forward, 2 step back way. And then following on with what we just talked about in terms of armoring, there really is no way to engineer to try and moderate or stop that process in a way that doesn't affect the functioning of the natural beach. Any artificial structure placed into the water that's designed to stop sediment necessarily will start to change the way those sediment patterns work and affect the natural functioning of the beach. And that leads to the third big point, which is that shoreline armoring is going to ultimately fail. The lakes are just too powerful. Either we're going to have to continue to spend lots of money over time to maintain them and replace them, or we're going to watch them fail. While they are in place and they're working unhappily, if they're really working well, to stop the kind of sand movement processes that Guy just talked about, that means they're going to eventually take all of the sand out of the system that would normally replenish the beach, and the beach is going to disappear. That's kind of the place we're headed as we more and more armor our shoreline. And then if they do finally fail, or when they finally fail, we're going to end up with really degraded natural beaches, which are going to create all kinds of public safety and navigational problems for small boats, especially as the waters go up and down. So we're really faced with some difficult combinations of natural forces combined with people's desire to live close to the water. So that's the dynamic natural system. Now let me shift to the governmental system that we have to deal with this. And it's almost as complex as what Guy described for the natural processes. So the first thing to note is that the Great Lakes are navigable waters of the United States. And so there's definitely a federal legal interest in those waters. So if you want to build a arming structure or a pier or a dock out into the water, you have to get a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. But that's honestly plays a relatively minor role for particularly private property owners. For the most part, most of the shorelines are managed by the state of Michigan. And for the most part, the state has delegated most of those management authorities down to local units of government. And we have 292 units of local government in the state of Michigan that touch one of our Great Lakes, and about another 30 that touch one of the connecting inner waterways, the rivers or the Houghton Waterway. So we have gobs of government that have an interest in Great Lakes waters, and every one of them has been able to do some things, planning and zoning or shoreline regulation, and play a role in this kind of complex combined management system that we need to figure out how to work with. Well, what is that management system? What's the legal system? Let me give you a little bit of a quick history lesson on some law that's relevant along Great Lakes shorelines. So the first body of law that we work with, I call the police power prerogative. I suspect some of you are local officials, and you probably know you have police power authorities. So the thing to know about that is that police power authority was recognized early on in our country's history by our court system, the federal courts and the state courts, as we tried to figure out what exactly are the powers that states have that they brought with them and kind of took on when they became states, when we separated ourselves from the English crown. And so we looked back and thought, well, in England, the colonies, the nation had the powers of parliament and the king and all of that, and that became wrapped up and became the police power. So under our federal US system, it's actually the states that were the first sovereign authorities. They gave up some authority to the national government when they created and joined into the US Constitution, but they retain a whole bunch of authority to protect public health, safety, morals, and the general welfare, both through programs that advance the public interest, regulations that are designed to protect the public interest. And they're viewed very expansively. So that police power authority that the states have are really important authorities to talk about when we think about coastal shoreline management. The second power that you should be aware of is one that's unique to ocean coastal settings and to the Great Lakes, and it's called the public trust doctrine. And this legal doctrine stretches its way all the way back to Roman time, Justinian's code, early on in the history of Rome, codified this notion that there are some things that are so important that they're common to all. People, everybody should have some kind of access to them and some ability to use them. And that includes the air, the running water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. So now in Roman law, we've got some notion that there's a general notion of our general right of public access and use to ocean waters and to the shoreland along ocean coasts. English jurists picked that up and folded that into English common law. And then when American jurists came around, when we became a separate country and we're trying to figure out, well, what doctrines do we have? All of the ocean coastal states adopted the notion that, hey, we have a public trust doctrine too on the ocean coast. Some things are common to all: the air, the running water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. And then each of the Great Lakes states, when they looked at their Great Lakes waters of body, they said, wait a minute, our Great Lakes are much more like ocean coasts than they are inland lakes. And so all of the 8 Great Lakes states have adopted the public trust doctrine as applying to their Great Lakes shorelines. That has some real implications that I'll talk about in a few minutes, but you should know that that doctrine and the police power authority are 2 really important doctrinal authorities that the state of Michigan has and local units of government have to manage Great Lakes coastal shorelines for the larger public interest. And then set against that are notions of private property rights. We believe in this country in strong private property rights that came out of our English heritage. John Locke was an English philosopher, a political scientist, philosopher who articulated this notion of ownership that got picked up into English common law, and it's been very well established in our American constitutional and common law. And it basically takes shape and form of protections that we have. The thing to know is in this country, when you own private property, what that means is you have the right to reasonably use that property and exclude others. And the protections that are in place are really designed to protect government from abusing our ability to use our property. Owning private property doesn't mean you have the right to do whatever you want with your land and the heck with everybody else. That's never been what ownership has meant either under English common law or American common law. It means you have some reasonable expectations and use of your property, and you especially have the right to know that government can't abuse you. Government can tell you you can't do that with your property, but it has to have a good reason for why it's doing that. That's basically how it unfolds. So all of those doctrines come together along the Great Lakes shoreline, and they'll play out as I'll talk through some of these planning and zoning issues that I'll talk about moving forward. So the key powers then are the police power authorities that have been delegated down to local units of government to do planning and zoning. I'll talk about that in a bit. And then the public trust doctrine is the source of authority that the state exercises when it manages submerged lands and when it manages high-risk erosion area programs. And it also tells us something about shoreline property ownership. So those are the authorities that governments act under. And then again, we have private property that are protected primarily through statutory protections in those various acts, and then federal and state constitutional due process and regulatory takings protections. And I'm not going to go into a lot of discussion about what that means, but I'm happy to talk about that later if folks have questions. Well, there are then some issues that pop up right away, and they all kind of boil down to drawing lines on the beach. Where do we know that these different authorities exist, and when do they overlap? And where do I own property if I own a shoreline? And how does that change over time as the lake changes? And one of the key concepts we're going to talk about is the ordinary high water mark. But before we get there, I want to point out that one of the things that the public trust doctrine establishes is the concept of a movable freehold. So if you are a shoreline property owner, or if you know a shoreline property owner who has a title to property that says your property runs to the edge or to the meander line, it might say, then what that means is your property line actually moves as the lakes go up and down, and that border between water and lakes move back and forth. So when the lakes go down, and if you happen to be on a beach that has sand that can accrete onto that beach and kind of build up that beach, then you're automatically getting more property. You're a property owner who has the benefit of enjoying that expanded beach. That's your property. So that's the one side of the movable freehold concept. The other side, unfortunately, is if you're on a shoreland that's got sandy erodible beaches and the lake is working away at that, then your ownership is shifting automatically to the state. So under the public trust doctrine, the state of Michigan owns the land submerged, the bottom land submerged under Great Lakes water. Upland property owners own the land adjacent to that. As that border moves back and forth, the boundary between state-owned property, submerged land, and privately owned upland shifts naturally back and forth. And then unhappily, that means if you are a shoreline property owner on property that is slowly eroding over time, your property is slowly transitioning automatically to state ownership as the lake works on that property and turns it away. So this is really unhappy news to convey to shoreline property owners, but you basically own a piece of land for a piece of time until the lake finally says it's time to take that land into the lake itself. So that's the legal doctrine that we've had in the state of Michigan really almost since the first court decision recognizing the public trust doctrine was decided 6 years after we became a state, and it's been well established ever since then. So that's a really robust doctrine. So that's the first thing to know about the public trust doctrine. The second thing to know is the public trust doctrine establishes some other rights, some balancing exercises we have to engage, and it does it through the concept of the ordinary high water mark. The idea behind the ordinary high water mark is there's a boundary line that corresponds to when the lake is close to its normal high level. So in an ocean coast, this is actually a little bit easier to think about conceptually. On an ocean coast, the waters go up and down twice a day, and there's a pretty well demarcated boundary of how high that shoreline gets during high tide. So the ordinary high water mark on an ocean coast is pretty much the high tide line. And what it means is people have the ability to walk on the sandy beach if there's a little bit of sandy beach during high tide, and they definitely have the right to walk along the beach during low tide. It allows for beachcombing. Well, we have the same thing in Michigan, except it's drawn out over years and decades instead of twice a day. And so we know there's portions of beach that will definitely be underwater. They have been in the past, they will be again. And so that kind of portion of beach is open to public access when the waters recede again, and it leaves some sandy beach to walk on. So in 2005, the Michigan Supreme Court handed down a decision, this was the beach walking case, that reaffirmed that yes, we have a public trust doctrine in Michigan. It establishes the movable freehold concept, and it says, and we have a right to walk on the beach. And that right extends somewhere to where the presence of the wave and water is so predominant that you can tell water's been there before. So it absolutely means it extends at least to that sandy area, because the reason it's sandy is there's been water there scarring away the seagrass and the trees. Might extend a little bit further, but most people just want to walk on the sand. So basically, if there's a dry sandy beach to walk on, that's part of the public trust. So let me illustrate this a little bit. So under the public trust doctrine, one of the key lines is the water's edge. If you're a private property shoreland owner, you own upland property. So all of the land above that water's edge is yours. But all of the land below that water is state-owned submerged bottomland. So that's the key title ownership line. The other key line on the sand is this natural ordinary high water mark, that place on the shore where there's clear evidence that the water's been there in the past. And that stretch of beach in between that natural ordinary high water mark and the water's edge is the public trust walkable beach. So another key concept that the public trust doctrine establishes for us is this notion of a public trust walkable beach that exists when the lakes are low. Now, if you're in a period of really high water and there's really no sandy beach left, then there's no public trust beach to walk on. It's underwater. It'll come back again when the lake levels go back down, but there may be periods during really extreme high water where there's no beach, there's no public trust beach to walk on. That's part of the natural process. There's a second ordinary high water mark, though, that came out of this legislation, or out of the Gecko case and some subsequent litigation, and is established under the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act. And it's based on this notion of an elevation ordinary high water mark. And let me explain that concept. So Guy mentioned that we measure the height of the lake's water level by sea level. Technically, it's actually established by this benchmark called the International Great Lakes Datum, IGLD, which approximates the seawater level. And the last time it was set was in 1985. So that becomes the base of the benchmark. And then we go up and we figure out what's the elevation above that IGLD that corresponds to these different water levels that are thought of as the ordinary high water elevations. So in Lake Superior, that's 602.6 feet above the IGLD, above sea level. And on Lakes Michigan Huron, that's 580.5 feet above sea level. So those are established by statute, and that's the second step we take to figure out, well, where's our elevation ordinary high water mark? The third step then is to draw a line from that elevation and figure out where that hits the beach. And then we draw a line perpendicular to the beach, and that becomes the ordinary high water mark. So remember, just for illustration, I suggested that maybe the natural ordinary high water mark is somewhere in here. And in here, just again for illustration, I'm showing this could be where the elevation-based ordinary high water mark falls. Now, actually, I think in practice, they're much closer together because they do kind of line up conceptually, but they can diverge, and I'll show you in a minute how that happens. But that's the way that we set the regular ordinary high water mark, and then that portion of beach then becomes the area that you have to get a permit from the state if you want to put some kind of a structure, a home or a seawall or something in that area. You're now within that regulated public trust beach. So those are the two different ordinary high marks and how they play out on the shoreline. So now here, remember that picture that Guy showed you of the house that got built right at the Michigan-Indiana border? Well, this was a house that was proposed that prompted a lawsuit. And at the time they wanted to build it was 2006. And because of the way the beach had inflated that Guy showed you, the sandy beach was all the way out here. And they said, we want to build a house and we don't have to get a permit. And the state said, oh, yes, you do. And it put a picture of what they wanted to build on top of an aerial photograph of what the beach had looked like just 20 years prior, and said, hey, look, there was no beach there. There's no beach where you want to build your house. Well, long story short, the state lost that suit on a kind of a technicality, but the court also recognized that this is a highly dynamic system. And what these hash marks show is where that ordinary high water mark was hitting the beach over time. And that's to highlight that it's really actually quite an unstable mark on the sand because of the way the shoreline dynamics work. And the house that just got built is sitting right there. So even though they knew that this is a highly dynamic system and there was no lake, there was no beach there before, they built that house and now it's sticking way out into the shoreline. So that's kind of the difficulty we're facing as people want to build when the lake levels are low and they're building in places that we know are going to be underwater again. So basically the ordinary high water mark and the elevation ordinary water mark, and then the state also has a program for high risk erosion areas. I won't talk too much about that here, but they regulate those. Those things together create the state regulated Great Lakes. So that's the legal background that kind of frames what we're trying to do as we look at our Great Lakes shorelines. Just to repeat quickly, what we're dealing with here is a great deal of uncertainty of our weather systems over time. And we have to think about dealing with them in terms of shocks and stresses. And shocks to the system are things like storms. So this was the Father's Day storm that hit Houghton a couple years ago. That was a 500-year storm, the so-called 0.2% storm that hit several times during that summer. So it's become a misnomer that just because it says a 500-year storm event doesn't mean it's not going to happen again for 499 years. Well, it hit. And it drew a whole lot of trouble. That's a storm that hit Detroit and did a huge amount of damage a few years ago. So dealing with shocks is a big challenge. The other challenge we have to deal with are the stresses, the long-term stresses that we're having to deal with. And mainly on Great Lakes shorelines, that's the long-term erosion of sandy shorelines and the movement of dunes. They're naturally moving systems as well. Now, I know that a lot of Lake Superior especially is hard and rocky. And those rock beds go deep enough that they're not going to fail like the armoring systems the guy talked about. So you don't have the benefit of sandy beaches when the lakes are low, but you get a lot more rock open beach that you can work with. The benefit you have is those shorelines aren't moving at all or nearly as much as the sandy beaches are. So I recognize a lot of what we're talking about are those stretches that you might have that are erosional sandy beaches, but that's where we're having a lot of trouble because people want to build too close to the sandy beach. And then what we're really dealing with are water level fluctuations and storminess. So that's just to remind you of that. So just very quickly, in the short term, we have several different options for addressing these kind of emergency conditions that we're facing. And this is done mainly at the state level. And we can either armor, or we can nourish, or we can pick up and relocate structures. And so there might actually be more things to do in between permanent armoring like this. There might be some benefit to putting really honking big sandbags. They've got tiger dams, I think they're called. They give some temporary relief, but you can open them once the lakes go back down. So that might be kind of an intermediate measure. And then, maybe you don't have to move your whole house this way. Maybe it's just moving some structures or a septic system to get it away from the water. If for whatever reason you put your septic system on the lake side of your property. But these are at the core, these are the basic things the basic approaches that we can take in the short term. So just to quickly point out, some pros and cons. So the pros of armoring is that it slows erosional processes. It's not going to stop them entirely, but it'll at least slow them down. But that comes at the loss of the natural public trust beach. If you build that sandy revetment or that shoreline revetment, eventually it's going to starve the sand of the system of the sand that it needs to replenish that beach. And we'll end up with beaches like New Jersey has. There's no beach left. All that they have are concrete wall beaches in long stretches because they've armored so much. So that's the trade-off that's happening there. If you nourish, that can also slow erosional processes, and it might be really effective, but it may only last a single storm. If the right storm comes in and hits it, it's going to take all of that sand that was deposited and pull it back out into the lake. So it may be a good short-term, probably not a good permanent solution. Really the best long-term permanent solution is to pick up structures and move them back. That comes with the benefit of conserving the natural public trust beach and kind of keeping those systems functioning naturally like they do best. But it comes at the cost of having to move structures. And it does mean that if you're in this area that's eroding, that natural erosion process is going to continue, and you might end up having to just take your house out if you don't have the ability to move it back. And I know that's a really difficult trade-off for people to have to contemplate. I'll talk more about that later. And this plays it out also in terms of private and public trade-offs, and they much parallel the kind of pros and cons. What I want to point out is if you start getting to the point where you're putting in armoring structures or renourishing structures or moving homes back, there's a real trade-off. We have to start thinking about who should pay for that, who's benefiting from it, who's paying for the armoring structures, who is that really working for? If we're going to do buyouts, do we buy out everybody, or do we buy out folks that are particularly financially strapped? What if somebody built too close to the water and they should have known that that was a bad place to build? Should the public be spending money to move them back? That means we're basically insuring them with public funds. There's some really difficult, thorny kind of capacity fairness trade-off issues that we have to think about with all of these different solutions. So one of the messages here in the short term, that quite often there's no easy, simple answer that's going to satisfy everybody. All of these options have both benefits, but they all come with some costs. And so the communities have to really think through what are the trade-offs that we're willing to engage here. In the long term, the trick is to start thinking ahead and making really good decisions now to do two things. One, to make sure that we don't continue to build in highly hazardous, dangerous places so that we don't make it worse. Don't stop digging a hole. If you find yourself digging in a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging. The second thing to do is set yourself up so that everybody's on notice that the time may come where we need to start moving things back from the shoreline, if at all possible. There may be places where we really do have to armor and just recognize that's going to be an ongoing cost. But ideally, if we can move back, let's figure out how to do that over the long term. The method we've come up with, and this is apparently happening at the local level through local governments, through their planning and zoning authorities. That's the way we've structured things in the state of Michigan. This is where we're developing decision-centered scenario-based planning. So the idea behind scenario-based planning is we're looking ahead to the future and we're realizing we don't know what the future is going to be. There's a whole lot of uncertainty here, both in terms of water levels and in terms of storminess. And so we frame out a lucky future that's where water levels look like they're going to stay low for a while and not too stormy. An expected future where the water levels are close to their long-term average and we're kind of getting typical 100-year storm events. And then the perfect storm, oh my gosh, the lakes are close to their all-time high and the really bad storms are hitting. We kind of like what we're experiencing now. So that's one part of the scenario-based planning approach. And then the second part is to say, well, what are we going to do about it? What are the different options we can take to manage our shorelines given those unpredictable possible futures? And one thing is to just look at what do we have now? That's current build out. That's kind of a benchmark. The other is to say, well, let's look at our zoning and see what we could have if we were to fully build out over time, if we're experiencing growth and development and we don't do anything to adjust the zoning the way it is now. And then the third option is to say, well, maybe if we adopted some best management practices, and that's mainly setbacks away from water features and low impact infrastructure. I'll talk about that more. Well, if you take those two aspects of uncertainty, this kind of high hazard areas, things that we cannot control, and combine them with the things we can control, the management options, you put them together and you get a set of scenarios. So each scenario then consists of some kind of future, a lucky, expected, or perfect storm, combined with some management option, what we currently have, what we could get under current zoning at full build out, what we might get with build out with BMPs. And so each scenario, then we can start thinking through, well, how many structures would be at risk? How much land area would be at risk? Where is the flooding going to take place that could do real damage? What's the impact on our infrastructure and what's the impact on our fiscal tax base that we need to worry about? So the way that then is to map these areas. So this is Grand Haven. We worked with Grand Haven extensively to develop this planning method. So the yellow is the area that's going to be underwater during a lucky storm event. And a lot of that actually is underwater because it's the floodway, it's the Grand River that's draining out, but it's also including some shoreline area that could get flooded under that kind of a 50-year storm. The burnt orange area is the area that could be flooded under an expected stormy future. And that's where you really see the floodplain starts to fill out. And honestly, for a lot of coastal communities, we talk a lot about the ocean front or the coast front, the Great Lakes front, and the risk there. But in fact, a lot of the damage that could take place is up here in the riverine system. So if you're in a community that has a river draining into the lake, you might be looking and paying a lot of attention to your river system, because that could be really a big part of your risk as well. And then finally, the bright red is the perfect storm. That's the area that's going to be affected by wave energy and flooding during that 500-year storm event when the lakes are really high. So now we know where are the areas that are especially at risk during these different climate futures. And then we can start mapping out, well, what do we have currently? These are the current structures in Grand Haven. The dots show you the structures that could be added in, that could be built under their current zoning code. So there's still a lot of room to develop in Grand Haven. They keep telling me they're built out, but they've got a lot of room to develop. And then here's the build out with some setbacks. And what the first thing to notice is managing for coastal hazard doesn't mean you have to stop all development in your community. And I know in the Upper Peninsula, you're not facing some of the development pressures that they are down in the lower part of the Lake Michigan, but you might be as things get worse with climate change, and maybe all those folks roasting to death in Texas right now thinking we need to move could very well be looking at the UP thinking, wow, that's the place to go. Well, you might start getting development pressure that might want you to think now about the kinds of zoning code positions you have to plan for that. The big difference between the future build out under current zoning and the build out with setbacks is we've taken out the development that could happen in the highest risky places. So you still have lots of room to build and develop in your community and be healthy, but now you're going to be more resilient because you're not letting development happen in the worst of the worst places. And then you can also do close-up looks and think about erosional lines, different ways to map out the rate of erosion along the shorefront and think through, well, if we want to start thinking about setbacks, how would we do that? What we've generally found, this is the same table that lines up the climate futures with the different management conditions. And what we found in all of the communities that we've worked with is you're never going to get away from risk. There's no way that we can live in this world without facing some kind of risk from storm events. So the idea here isn't to make us completely resistant to any kind of risk, but it is to greatly minimize the potential risk we could face. And what we found is if communities build out under their current zoning, they have the kinds of setbacks and other BMPs you would want to have, they're really facing a huge amount of potential risk as the climate future gets worse and as they continue to build out, because they're letting too many people build or they're potentially letting too many people build in high-risk places. And if they adopt some basic BMPs, they're still going to see maybe some more risk, but they could really greatly minimize that risk of future build out. So this is where resilience starts to come from. It's taking account of how we could build out and making sure through the different analyses we do that it's not going to happen in the most dangerous places. So that's a really important part of the planning process. And then the next step is to think about implementing those plans through zoning codes and other kinds of policies. And the very first thing to do is think about how you're managing your water. The last thing you want to do is let all of the water run really quickly into the water systems. That's going to exacerbate the flooding effects. And you also don't want to route the water in such a way that's going to increase erosional processes. So start thinking about low impact development, like these kinds of swales off of parking lots that grab that water and let it slowly sink back into the soils and then slowly get back into the system. That helps to slow down that flooding and erosional process. So SUMCOG is another good source of these kinds of low impact development. They created a manual in 2008 that has some really nice examples of things you might think about. So that's one key set of policies to start thinking about to implement good community resilience. The other is to start thinking about shorefront overlay districts. If you've got some shorefront that's eroding, now's the time to start thinking about adopting setbacks that are based on all of the analyses I just showed you that are tied to the dynamics of the lake that you know you're going to have to adjust periodically if in fact you're eroding and kind of keep shifting them back. But this has the effect of putting property owners on notice, hey, you're in a place that's hazardous and the time may come where you're going to have to pick up and move. And if you look right there, that's the house that I started off with in the presentation. That was the house that got built in St. Joseph. It was actually the building of that house that prompted the city of St. Joe to say, wait a minute, what's happening here? They didn't have a setback when that property owner wanted to build. They had no way to tell the property owner, no, that's a really bad thing to do. In fact, they did tell the property owner over and over again, don't do it, it's a bad thing to do, but they didn't have a regulation in place to tell them, we're not going to let you do that. They built their house. the neighbors got really mad because they're thinking what Guy Meadows just showed us. If they build a seawall, that's going to start scarring away everybody else's beach and make it worse for us. They gave the city a whole bunch of money. They did a study. They established, yep, that wasn't a good place to build a house. And they adopted in their zoning code the setback line. And they made it clear, we're going to adjust this periodically. If we start to see erosion, we're going to start shifting it back so people know what's coming. In the meantime, this house, they came forward and it started to ask for a permit to build a seawall. And the city said, nope, we're not going to let you do it. We told you it was a bad thing to do. You built anyways. Now we've adopted a zoning ordinance that says you can't destroy our Great Lakes beaches. So the house that I showed you as an example of relocation, that was the house that they had to pick that house up and they moved it back. Unfortunately, they couldn't move it back as far as they should have because they already had another house there that's sitting on the ground that they couldn't move back as well. So hopefully they'll be safe for a period of time. We don't know. They are benefiting a little bit because of that harbor structure, but it's not clear if that's really going to save them or if that erosion is going to continue. So adopting dynamic coastal shoreline zoning based on really good planning studies is the long-term way to think about how to manage your shorefronts, especially for these kinds of eroding settings. And that's really a local function. The state is not doing this kind of work. It's going to come down to localities taking this on if you want to manage your communities for resilience. So let me just finish up with some points here. So we need to recognize some ongoing challenges that we're now all facing. One is there's a new normal out there. We are seeing increased storminess. Guy mentioned we're expecting over the next 50 years that the storms are going to get more fierce. We're also expecting that the lakes are going to continue to fluctuate. We know they're going to go up and down. Now they're thinking maybe when they get high, they're going to get higher, and when they get low, they're going to get lower because of this increased storminess. And so that means we're probably going to see erosion pick up. We're not likely to see another one of those really long-term 14-year low periods where lots of sand gets pushed up onto the beach. We're probably going to see erosion pick up. And that's where we're getting into trouble because of this disconnect that property owners have. When the lakes go down, they say, aha, we can build, look at all that beach we have to build on. And so there's a real challenge here in getting folks to recognize the long-term processes that are taking place. There are some real disconnects. The next big challenge is we're not going to lose our Great Lakes beaches all at once. We're going to lose them by 1,000 cuts. As we allow over and over again people to put in their little piece of seawall because of an emergency response. I think the big concern everybody's starting to really worry about is, oh my gosh, we could end up like New Jersey, the New Jerseyization of Michigan's Great Lake coast that's totally armored in a big bathtub with big stones and seawalls because it's happened one project at a time. So that's kind of the long-term accretional change to the shoreline that we're really worried about. The second big challenge we're facing right now, and this is not unique to the Great Lakes at all, but there's a whole lot of political polarization out there right now that's really making it difficult to engage in good community planning. It's making it very contentious. And so I tell my planning students and everybody really, if we want to do a good job of figuring out how to get through some of these really challenging periods, then we need to figure out how to start talking to one another again and trying to figure out how to, in a creative way and productive way, get over the political polarization that seems to be taking place. And I don't minimize how challenging that's going to be. The other challenge we face is we've got to get away from thinking there's a one-size-fits-all silver bullet that's landscape dumb. And right now, frankly, that one-size silver bullet is revetments. Everybody's thinking that's the solution, and we want to put them everywhere, and it's going to solve all of our problems. And in fact, it's not going to solve all our problems, and it's probably not a good solution anywhere. And even where it is a good solution, we're probably not designing and applying them very well. So we need to be much more sophisticated about how we think about the right solutions in the right places. Another big problem we're facing, frankly, is underinvestment in government. We've for so long said we don't want to pay taxes. I totally get that. I understand that's why. But we're incapacitating our government and its ability to work on our behalf. There was a big flood, you might have heard, in Midland a couple months ago, early this summer, and it came out in the news. The state of Michigan has over 1,000 dams, 1,000 dams on inland rivers in the state. A good number of them, I think about half, are at risk of failure. We only have 2 inspectors in the state of Michigan who are responsible for making sure those dams are safe. So now I heard they're going to increase that 100%, hire 2 more inspectors. But that's just a remarkably little amount of state capacity to deal with these really pressing issues. Well, I know that a lot of coastal communities are really small and they've got really limited staff capacity. And so we're asking a whole lot of them to do this really important management work if we're not willing to pay to hire some planners and city managers and township managers to really do the good analysis we need to serve us. So that's becoming more and more a real challenge in front of us. Another big challenge is we're creating unfortunate expectations. The more that we let people armor really easily because of their concerns, the more we're creating an expectation that shoreline protection is the way to go. And Guy mentioned this, and I'll push back a little bit, not on him, but when people use the term shoreline protection, that's really not an accurate word. The shoreline protection, the armoring they want to put in is going to destroy the shoreline. All it really is doing is slowing down erosion to try and protect the house that's behind it. And it's not a permanent solution. It's really expensive, and it's going to destroy the shoreline in the process. And so because of the policy decisions we're making right now, we're creating some really difficult expectations to get over the long term. And then finally, the really big human nature thing is loss aversion is greater than prudence. Once people build a home and they have it and they value it and they love it, the idea of giving it up or moving it back becomes just overwhelming. And even though what we're hearing is, even though it may be as or cheaper to pick up a house and move it back, people's first inclination is want to put the seawall in front of it, even though that may cost them more and it's going to be ineffective because they don't want to give up what they already have. So there's a lot of human nature that we're kind of working against here that's totally understandable, but it really makes it hard to be effective in our management. So how do we deal with that? We need to do really good planning. We need to get the public involved. All of the public, all of the state citizens in the state have a right to use the public trust beach. And so everybody's got an interest on the shorelines. We need to get everybody involved, including the shoreline property owners, but also including the shoreline walkers, and do good planning up front. We need to have good governance. We need to make sure we have a big enough government, not big government. We need to have good government that is capable of doing what we need government to do. We need to really start tailoring our policies so that they really fit the places where we live, and they're landscape smart. They're the right policies for the right place at the right time. And there's a whole lot more we could be doing to improve that. We need to adopt no regrets policies. There are a lot of the low impact development infrastructure policies I mentioned. Even if we end up not getting the big storm that we might get, there's still really good systems to put in place. They're going to make us better off no matter what. So there are a lot of these policies that we can do. Move back a little bit. Don't bulldoze your dune for a better view, because that's going to undermine your ability to have a dune for a long time. A lot of things that we can do that even if the storms aren't quite so bad as what we fear they might be, we're still better off. Those are called no regrets policies. And then we need to really learn, instead of kind of wanting to put a stake down on the ground and say, here I will stand and I'm going to fight nature tooth and nail to the end of the time. Well, you're going to lose. Nature's going to win. Mother Nature is so powerfully overwhelmingly powerful, especially on the Great Lakes shoreline. We really need to start to figure out how to better to live with nature, adapt and relocate if necessary, and really only go toward shoreline hardening if there's a really, really, really compelling reason to do that, recognizing the cost that's going to come with it, and making sure the community understands what those trade-offs are. And then finally, we need to invert the way we think about our economies. Instead of thinking about cranking the economy and then kind of cleaning up the environmental mess afterwards, we need to recognize more and more our economies are based on the healthy natural resources that we have. And we have to protect those resources first, and then enable us to have the kind of economic development and growth in really vital economies that we need to have in place. So that's stewardship economics. So think about the Pure Michigan campaign. They never show pictures of hardened shorelines or degraded shorelines to try and get folks to come up and vacation. They show the wide sandy beaches that people want to come and stroll on. It's protecting that resource base that's going to give us the economic growth and development that we want. And maybe even encourage some folks who are down south, hey, Michigan would be a great place to live. Come up and join us, but do it in going to be resilient and kind of smart and a happy, fruitful way into the future. So that's where we're headed. That's my presentation. All of the work that we've been doing with Leah and with the state is trying to give local governments the tools that you can work with to develop these kinds of policies and make sure that you're making your community really as resilient as you possibly can. And if we've got you intrigued at all about stuff you might be able to do or want to look at in your community, talk to Zach, because he's the guy who can help line you up and take advantage of some of that grant funding to do some of that work. So thanks again for hanging out with me that whole way through. I know I threw a lot of information at you. I'm happy to answer questions if folks have any.
Yes, it does look like we have one. David, you should be unmuted now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Hey, David.
Hello. Just a simple question. I found the discussion on the Michigan Supreme Court decision on the public trust interesting. If I want to go out to somebody's private island, let's say it's, I don't know, 5 acres, 10 acres with a house on it, and there is that area between the water and the nominal high water mark, can I just jump off my boat and walk around the island?
That's a really good question. Boy, every time I do this webinar, I get another question that I haven't gotten yet and haven't thought about. So I'm going to be a good lawyer here. I'm a lawyer, by the way. I'm going to be a good lawyer and tell you that's a really good question. I think I have to look that up and get back to you. My first inclination is to say probably yes. I think the public trust doctrine applies on our Great Lakes island beaches. So if there is a sandy beach, you probably have the right to be strolling on it, even if it's a privately owned island. Now, I didn't say this, but one thing I always tell people is, if you're a shoreline property owner, you need to recognize that folks have a right to be walking on the beach in front of your house, kind of like a sidewalk. Just like I own a home in Ann Arbor, people walk in front of my home all the time. They stop and look at the house, they stop and look at the street, that's fine. If you're a shoreland walker, you need to recognize that's private property. You have a right to stroll, but that doesn't mean you have a barbecue picnic in front of somebody's home or kind of put your chair down and read a paper or something. So there's a bit of balancing that needs to happen, and we need to make sure that beach users recognize that's privately owned property. You have a right to walk along it. You don't have a right to have a picnic. So if you're going out onto a Great Lakes island and you're strolling on the beach, you probably want to make sure you keep strolling. You don't just kind of pull up on the beach and have a picnic on basically on someone's front yard. So I think that would be kind of the balance that I would suggest that you try and strike. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it wouldn't be appropriate to pull my boat up on their beach then, huh?
Probably not. Probably not. I think that would be kind of pushing it a bit.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I do know if you're in a storm, you know, you're out in the water and the only place you can get out of the storm, there is kind of a right to shelter, but that's a very limited exception. Generally, if the weather's nice, you probably don't want to be pulling a boat up onto someone's beach and leaving it there.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, we have another question from Marita. You should be able to talk now. If you unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you. I think I'm hello, and thank you for this. I think this is a very important conversation. I'm sitting in Gulliver, Michigan, on a shoreline, Lake Michigan, where I have walked for about 60 years. And in fact, I have a photo that Guy might be interested in, which was taken in the 1930s when this area was being developed as the old Deerfield project, which never actually came to fruition. And shows a huge, wide beach, which my cousin also remembers from the 60s in racing cars down here on the beach. Now, obviously, we don't have that. But when we built the home here in 1992, our architect worked with the state of Michigan, and we were under then the Critical Dunes Act. Mm-hmm. And we waited almost a year to get permission for the siting of this house. They mapped every dune, every tree in order to make sure that this house was properly sited, and it needed to be behind what was then considered the secondary dune. Yep. Now we watch the water coming closer. And so I sit here thinking that this is a home that would be passed down for generations in my family. Yet I'm hearing today nothing about critical dunes, nothing about the state having a responsibility, but rather the emphasis is on private homeowners. And I'm wondering what resources are going to be available, or is there at least some assessment that I can get of what risks are very specific to this property, which was subject to the Critical Dunes Act, and now that seems to have gone away. What's the deal?
Yeah, no, it hasn't gone away, and you're exactly right. Another key piece of legislation on the shoreline is the Critical Dunes Act, and I didn't talk about it just because there's so much to talk about and so little time. There are two different acts. They deal, even though the resources are connected, they're dealt with separately under this statutory approaches. So the state did identify and map what it calls state designated critical dunes. And it sounds like you're in one of those. And if you do want to build a house in there or move it, you have to get a state permit to do so. The state gave local governments the ability to administer that act, but most of the local governments have given it back. They don't want to deal with that. So if you're wanting to move your house because you think it's now at risk and you want to move it back and that's going further back into the dune, then you do have to work with the state's Coastal Dune Act. And frankly, that's an issue that I don't think the state has really reckoned with yet, because it's really just within the last year or two that homeowners like you are really starting to feel the pressure of the lakes encroaching up onto them, and they're kind of backed up against a dune that they had to get a permit through the Dune Act to build in the first place. And I don't think the state quite yet has figured out, are we going to let people move their homes back more into the dunes, or what are we going to do there? So unfortunately, again, I don't have a really good answer. There are definitely some things, there's some aspects of this management system that we're probably not going to know how they're going to resolve until the state kind of formally announces some policies, or frankly, some litigation happens and it goes into the courts and some really pressing questions get answered. For example, if people build a revetment and there's no longer a public trust beach to walk on, does that mean you can walk across the revetment? Because the beaches would have been there but for the revetment. We don't know that for sure. It's never been litigated. The issue that you're raising, I'm not quite sure, frankly. You would have to be working with the state officials who administer the Coastal Dune Act and figure out what's the balance there that you're going to work out on that. Does that make sense? Is that answering your question?
Well, you know, it would seem to make sense, but I've had some experience, and I don't want to get into a whole lot of the personal part of things here, but 2 years ago, I needed to take down some very tall pines, white pines that were going to fall on the house.
Oh.
And I knew that as a critical dune, I had to ask permission. And so in fact, I did that. But I learned when I called the state that they said, the Critical Dune Act is not something that we enforce anymore. It doesn't have any force. It doesn't mean anything. You're not in it. It was dismissed. But at the same time, in order to take down the tall pines, I was told I had to have someone come and evaluate my pines. So I think that the state is not at all clear on this. And so I end up still in a worrisome position. I don't feel that I'm in danger of Lake Michigan coming into over the primary dune anytime soon at all. I'm more planning ahead for what this really can mean long term.
Yeah. Well, maybe the other thing I'll note is it could be that you're not in a state designated critical dune. And if that may be why the state was telling you that you're not subject to their regulations. But I can assure you, where there's designated state dunes, you still have to work with the state. I see Matt has turned on his camera. He's the state official here. Can you?
Yeah, so I was going to chime in just briefly. And the caveat is I do not work directly in the regulatory programs, but I can assure you that the Critical Dune Act is still on the books, and it is still certainly in effect. And certainly if you want to follow up with me, I could help get you in contact with folks in that program, if that would be helpful. There were some changes to the critical dune legislation back in 2012 that kind of relaxed a few components within the statute, but the statute is certainly still on the books. So Dick touched on a different possibility. It sounds like you were certain back in the day that you are located in a critical dune area, but that would be the other question. The areas have not changed over the years since the act was implemented in 1989. So I'd be surprised. But yeah, critical dunes is still on the books, and it's an active program.
Yeah, so my advice is follow up with Matt.
We'll definitely do that. And I will probably also send along to Guy the photo from the 30s, because it's an interesting photo. I see he's got his thumbs up. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
All right, thank you, Marita. Does anybody else have any questions before we wrap up here? Seeing none. Thank you very much for attending the webinar, everybody. Again, if you're interested in any of the grant opportunities or if you have any other questions for our panelists, feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you with both of those, zvega@liaa.org. But seeing no more questions, have a good night and thanks for sticking through with us.
Take care, everybody. Stay healthy and safe.